Before I watch this, I should make you aware of the fact that I know almost nothing about furries, and for what I do know, I probably shouldn't be too certain of. Only recently have I met someone that was an open furry. Even then, we haven't really ever talked about what that entails. Other than that, to my knowledge, I've never known anyone who would identify themselves as a furry, and if they did, they never told me about it. Even further than that, I've only heard a couple of stories about what it's like inside the furry community. It sounds like it can get quite dramatic, even more so than the typical dramatics that may take place in other fandoms. Despite my lack of knowledge on the topic, I will say that from what I've gathered of it, the idea seems kind of strange to me. Is it really just a physical attraction to anthropomorphic animals? If so, that would not only limit how much of the fandom I'm capable of comprehending, but it would also raise a number of questions that I'd rather ask in conversation or debate rather than at the podium. But my initial assumptions are completely irrelevant anyway. I know better than to let a little understanding of a subject or a type of person that I have color how I think or feel about an entire demographic. Now this isn't because I'm ignorant of furries, but rather that I simply don't have much exposure to that particular fandom and never really felt a need to study it. So with that, I jumped at the opportunity to learn when Tails is the Best One asked me to review Furries, an inside look. So let's see how close my initial assumptions were, and hopefully I can get some of these things cleared up if they're not close at all. In the beginning of the documentary, the narrator gives the best initial definition of a furry that he can do while staying ambiguous enough to cover the wide variety of furries that there are. During the first few minutes, he was covering things I sort of already knew, so my attention was able to drift off to other aspects of the video, such as the amazing artwork that was being superimposed on the B-roll during the definition. And then there's the matter of the B-roll footage itself, which starts out with what appears to be a fursuit parade going on inside a convention center. Now my thoughts on that were something along the lines of, gosh darn, those suits are big, heavy, and extremely hot inside. I was getting paid a lot of money the last time I was in a costume like that, and I couldn't imagine putting myself in one again under any different circumstances, especially if I'm going to be running about indoors where dozens of other people are doing the exact same thing.
I know I'm crammed into a Toyota Cressida with 4 furries on a 6-hour journey to Toronto to go to a furry party at a convention. That had to be in like 1995, 96 time frame.
And with that, my initial assumptions on the age range of most furries is blown right out of the water.
I don't know, I don't consider myself that interesting a person.
You were just introduced as a storyteller, and then you go on to say that you have a PhD in chemistry. I admire your humbleness, but I highly disagree.
When I go home and I go to work, I'm not a furry. I don't act like it. I've got my own name. I don't try to implement it very often.
As of this point, we have yet to establish how exactly a furry acts or if there is a mannerism that is quote-unquote typical of furries, so I'm really not certain how much weight that statement carries right now.
Every once in a while I might have to make a phone call at work or talk to somebody during business hours. I've gotten very good at ducking outside, sometimes more often than is warranted. I just say to the boss, oh, gotta go, Taco Bell, and then he just doesn't ask any questions.
Now that is an interesting statement to me. It expresses what would appear to be a common separation of one's life outside the fandom and the fandom itself, and it makes me wonder what would happen if Kage's boss knew about these conventions and this fandom which he participates in. I'm tempted to guess that this separation comes from the difficulty of explaining what a furry is to someone who isn't a furry, either for not knowing how, or for fearing any stigmas that may be attached. I already told you about the initial assumptions I had to make based off the very little prior information I had to go on, and this seems to be a highly stigmatized fandom, perhaps even more so than bronies, and if that's the case, revealing oneself as a furry could bring regrettable consequences. I've talked with bronies who have had falling outs with friends, family, and even divorced because of the stigma that came with the My Little Pony franchise. Being a furry could very possibly yield similar results, although Smash seemed to be the only one that was both willing and able to successfully integrate his fandom with his life, so there's hope yet, I guess. During the last few minutes of the second part and the first few minutes of the third part, they started to address the issue of the sexuality stigma. I was actually glad when they did this because it seemed like an opportunity to explain a lot of the questions I had asked myself before watching the documentary, and it did just that. Kage talked about how the first furry convention in the 1980s gave the furries a face of deviancy that they've been dealing with ever since. He then talked about how the overt perverts of the fandom are in fact a minority, but are generally not turned away from the conventions due to the open nature of the fandoms. This, combined with the various outside medias looking for a shock story, will cause these types of people to appear in the spotlight and continue to hurt the general image of the fandom. This is what would make being a furry so difficult to explain to someone who's not a furry. This is also probably why the little bit of knowledge that I had going into this didn't seem all that promising. But even with all of that, there are still some questions left unanswered, such as what a quote-unquote typical furry acts like. Now, this issue was hinted at earlier on in one of the interviews, but it was never really mentioned again. And there's also the question of how big the perverse problem really is. Kage mentions the strict code of conduct at Anthrocon at one point. The motivation for this must have come from somewhere, especially if the first furry convention in Southern California was marketed towards those he described as having quote-unquote colorful hobbies. It's entirely possible that putting that type of face on the fandom will not only repel a lot of people on the outside, as it has, but also attract even more deviancy from the outside and bring it in. I'd also like to hear a few different stories on how it's affected their lives. I was very grateful to hear that the fandom acts as a creative vent for a lot of people. That's awesome, as I believe that everyone needs a creative vent of some kind. But since it seems to have such a stigma, I'm curious to know how many furries have come out, so to speak, as a furry to their friends and family, and if it's affected their relationships. Beyond that, if it's affected their relationships, I'd like to know in what ways and what the percentage of the various reactions are, perhaps even offering a solution if the average reaction is not a good one. They ended the documentary on a very interesting note in talking about why furries express themselves the way they do. It makes a lot of sense and actually ties it up as simply a different form of art. I just wish that they hadn't mixed the music track into it so loudly as it distracted from the closing statements. The documentary did a good job of putting furries in a good light and giving me something different from everything else I had heard about them before. It seems to be serving a similar purpose to that of the BronyCon documentary, but is done in a much shorter format while providing information that the majority of others might not have known, whereas the BronyCon documentary took twice as long to make all the same points and presented the information to a lot of people that already knew what was being told while having no balance. But by the same token, the problems that the documentary has are similar to that of the BronyCon documentary in that it was probably made for furries just as much or more than it was made for those who don't know what a furry is. I believe this is shown every once in a while when a term would get thrown out casually, or a certain aspect of being a furry was discussed in passing as if it were common knowledge. These issues are somewhat excusable by the shorter format of this particular documentary. However, something I don't believe is excusable are the excruciatingly long talking head sections. Not only were they longer than that of the BronyCon documentary, but they were some of the longest ones I've ever seen in any documentary, and they often lacked B-roll footage to go over it. These are the types of things that make a lot of documentaries boring and or difficult to watch. To put it simply, I shouldn't be tempted to tab over and play solitaire while I'm trying to listen to your life story. Ultimately, I didn't learn a whole lot. But what I did learn was absolutely substantial. If what was said in this short documentary holds any weight as a representation to the fandom as a whole, then I'm very glad that I watched it. Now that I know that it's more about creativity and self-expression than some vague, probably unfounded Freudian connection to cartoon characters, I have examples of this fandom in a positive light to counter with when I see someone speak ill of it in the future. There's probably still a whole lot about the furry fandom that was not mentioned in this documentary, and I'm still not going to say that I know very much, if anything, about the community. What I will say is that it was a predominantly interesting experience that helped me understand why someone might draw parallels between being a brony and being a furry, especially if you're a furry that is also a brony, which according to the Verbose and OPSBE survey of bronies is about 13%. But that's all I have to say about that. And as always, if you disagree with my points or have a point that you believe that I missed, feel free to let me know so that we may discuss it further. If you have a topic you would like to hear discussed, or if you have an episode, fanfiction, product, or anything else you would like to hear reviewed, send me a YouTube message or leave a comment below. You can also drop comments, questions, topic suggestions, and review suggestions by liking Brony Debates on Facebook, following on Twitter, or sending an email to bronydebates@yahoo.com. Have a great day, and I look forward to hearing from all of you soon.